Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like something inside you shifted, but nothing around you changed? Same room, same routine, same people, but suddenly everything feels unfamiliar. Not because it is different, but because you are. You wake up and you can't explain it. You go through your day and everything works the same, but it doesn't feel the same. Conversations feel thinner. Moments feel quieter. Even things that used to excite you now feel distant, like you're watching your own life instead of living it. And you try to explain it away. Maybe I'm tired. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I just need a break. But the feeling doesn't leave. It follows you into silence, into noise, into places that once felt full, but now feel empty. So let me tell you something clearly. You are not losing yourself. You are being interrupted. And when God interrupts your life, it rarely feels peaceful at first. Because throughout Scripture, God never begins transformation with clarity. He begins it with disruption. Before direction, there is confusion. Before calling, there is tension. Before purpose, there is pressure. Noah felt it before the rain ever came. Abraham felt it before he ever moved. Moses felt it before he ever spoke. Nothing changed around them at first, but inside them, something started shifting, and that shift did not feel comfortable. It felt like something was off, because when God begins to move you, He doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes He just removes your peace from where you are. And that is where it begins. The first sign that something is changing is not clarity. It is restlessness. You wake up and something feels wrong, but you don't know what. You go through your routine, but it doesn't satisfy you. Things that used to bring you joy now feel empty. Even good things feel incomplete, and that confuses you because nothing is technically broken. So why does it feel like something is missing? Because God removes your satisfaction before He reveals your direction. As long as you are comfortable where you are, you will never move toward where you are called. So He disrupts your comfort first, quietly, gradually, without explanation. You start noticing things you used to ignore. Conversations that once felt normal now feel shallow. Environments that once felt safe now feel limiting. You begin questioning things you never questioned before. And you think something is wrong with you, but nothing is wrong with you. Your spirit has simply outgrown your current environment. And growth always creates friction. That friction is what you feel. That discomfort is what confuses you. And most people misinterpret it. They try to fix it with distraction, more noise, more entertainment, more busyness. But distraction doesn't remove restlessness. It only delays understanding it, because restlessness is not something to escape. It is something to listen to. It is a signal. It is telling you that you are no longer meant to stay where you are. And if you ignore it, it will only get louder, because God doesn't push you forward by force. He pulls you forward by changing what you are willing to tolerate. Suddenly, what you once accepted becomes unbearable. What you once enjoyed becomes draining. What you once chased becomes meaningless. And that shift is not random. It is intentional. Because when God changes your life, He doesn't start with your circumstances. He starts with your desires. He changes what you hunger for. And hunger is powerful. Hunger will move you faster than obligation ever could. But here's the tension at this stage. You feel the hunger, but you don't see the destination. So you are stuck in between, no longer satisfied with your old life, but not yet clear on your new one. And that space feels uncomfortable. It feels uncertain. It feels like you are losing control, but you are not losing control. You are losing attachment to what no longer fits you. And that is necessary, because you cannot step into something new while holding on to something old. So God doesn't just tell you to move. He makes staying feel impossible. And that is what restlessness really is, not confusion. Direction, but only if you are willing to listen, because if you numb it, you delay it. If you ignore it, you extend it. If you distract yourself, you miss it. But if you sit with it, something begins to shift. What once felt like frustration starts to feel like guidance. What once felt like emptiness starts to feel like space being created. And that is when you realize something powerful. You were not losing interest in life. You were losing tolerance for a life that no longer aligns with who you are becoming. And that realization changes everything. But here is where it gets harder. Because once that shift begins inside you, it doesn't stay internal. It starts affecting your relationships. You begin noticing that you don't connect the same way anymore. Conversations feel different, not wrong, just shallow. You sit with people you used to enjoy, but something feels off. You try to engage, but it feels forced. You try to laugh, but it doesn't reach you the same way. And now you are not just confused about yourself. You are confused about your connections. You start asking questions. Why does this feel different? Why do I feel distant? Why does everything feel harder to connect with? And here's the truth. You are not disconnecting. You are transitioning. Because when God changes your direction, He often changes your environment. Not always suddenly, sometimes slowly, quietly, without explanation. People don't disappear overnight. They fade. Conversations shorten. Energy shifts. There is no argument, no clear ending, just distance. And that kind of distance is painful because it gives you no closure, no explanation, no reason. So your mind tries to fill the gap. Did I do something wrong? Did I change too much? Am I becoming someone people don't understand? But the truth is simpler than that. Some connections were built for who you were, not who you are becoming. And when you change, alignment changes. It is not about good or bad people. It is about direction. When two people are walking the same path, they stay close. But when one changes direction, distance becomes inevitable. And sometimes you are the only one changing. So from their perspective, nothing is wrong. But from yours, everything feels different. And that creates tension because you are experiencing something they cannot see. And that makes it lonely because you feel it, and they don't. You are adjusting, and they are comfortable. You are evolving, and they are consistent. And neither side is wrong, but the gap keeps growing. And here is what makes it even harder. You still care. This is not rejection. This is not conflict. This is not conflict. This is misalignment. And misalignment hurts because there is no villain, no one to blame. Just a quiet realization that something no longer fits. And part of you wants to fix it, to force connection back into something that used to work. But you cannot force alignment. You can maintain contact, but you cannot manufacture depth when your paths are no longer the same. And this is where many people delay their growth, because they choose comfort over alignment. They shrink themselves to stay connected. They silence their hunger to keep relationships. But that comes at a cost, because every time you ignore your growth, you reinforce your past. And the more you do that, the harder it becomes to move forward. That is why separation is necessary, not because people are bad, but because growth requires space. Before elevation, there is always isolation. Before clarity, there is quiet. Before direction, there is distance. Look at every story. Before Joseph ruled, he was removed. Before David led, he was separated. Before Jesus stepped into ministry, he withdrew into the wilderness. Not because he was lost, but because he needed clarity. because clarity does not grow in noise, it grows in silence. When voices decrease, focus increases. When distractions fade, direction sharpens. But it feels like loss, because you're not just losing people. You are losing familiarity, and familiarity feels safe. So when it starts slipping away, your instinct is to hold on tighter. But holding on to what no longer aligns only prolongs the discomfort. Because deep down, you already know something has changed. And here is the hardest truth. Not everyone is meant to walk with you forever. Some people are part of a chapter, not the whole story. And when that chapter ends, it does not always close cleanly. Sometimes it fades, sometimes it stretches, sometimes it lingers, because you are not ready to let go. But growth requires release, and that is why this stage feels heavy, because you are not just moving forward, you are letting go. You are grieving what was, even if it no longer fits, and grief is not always about losing something good. Sometimes it is about releasing something familiar. But separation is not abandonment, it is repositioning, and repositioning always requires movement, even when it feels like loss. But here is where things intensify, because once separation begins, pressure follows, and this pressure does not come from inside you. It comes from around you. People start reacting differently. Situations feel heavier. Tension increases in ways you cannot explain. You start feeling resistance where there used to be ease. And now a new question appears. Why does everything feel harder now that I am trying to move forward? And that question leads to something deeper. Because what you are experiencing is no longer just emotional. It begins to feel like opposition, not logical, not predictable, almost personal. People misunderstand you without reason. They react to you without cause. They compete with you without invitation. And you sit there wondering what you did wrong, but the truth is, you did nothing, and that is exactly the point. Because it is not about what you did, it is about what you carry. When something inside you changes, it becomes visible even when you say nothing. And people respond to what they sense, not what you explain. That is why some reactions feel disproportionate, because the response is not to your actions. It is to your presence. And that is when things begin to feel like a battle. Not because you are fighting, but because something around you is reacting. And that reaction creates pressure, and that pressure exposes something else. Not around you, inside you, because now it is not just about external tension. It is about internal conflict. You begin questioning yourself, doubting your direction, wondering if you misunderstood everything. One day you feel clear, the next day you feel uncertain. One moment you feel strong, the next moment you feel overwhelmed. And you start asking, why am I so unstable? But you are not unstable. You are transitioning, because when your identity is shifting, your emotions will fluctuate. You are no longer who you were, but you are not fully who you are becoming. And that space feels unpredictable. It feels like standing between two realities, and not fully belonging to either. And that creates emotional waves, peace one moment, confusion the next, clarity one day, doubt the next. And that does not mean you are going backward. It means something deeper is being rebuilt, because God is not just changing your circumstances. He is changing your foundation. And when your foundation shifts, everything on top of it feels unstable for a while. But instability is not failure. It is reconstruction. And reconstruction is never comfortable, because it requires breaking what used to hold you, so something stronger can replace it. And that process feels like pressure. But pressure reveals what is real. It shows you what you depend on, what you trust, what you hold on to. And during this stage, You begin seeing yourself more clearly. Your reactions, your motives, your patterns, things you used to ignore now stand out. Not because someone pointed them out, but because your awareness increased. And that awareness feels uncomfortable, because you can no longer pretend not to see. But that is not condemnation. That is refinement. Because when God prepares you for something greater, He refines what cannot go with. He exposes what needs to change, not to shame you, but to shape you. And that shaping process is internal before it is external. Before elevation, there is alignment. Before influence, there is integrity. Before clarity, there is confrontation. And that confrontation is not with others, it is with yourself. And that is where real transformation happens, quietly. Internally, without applause, without recognition, but with depth. And as this process continues, something else begins to form. Not loud, not obvious, but persistent. A pull. You start feeling drawn toward something deeper, something more meaningful. You cannot fully explain it, but you feel it. A desire for purpose, a hunger for something beyond routine, a sense that your life is meant for more than what you are currently living. And that feeling grows, slowly, quietly, consistently, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And that is where everything begins to make sense, because the restlessness, the separation, the pressure, the confusion were never random, they were preparation. You were not losing your life. You were being led into it. You were not falling apart. You were being reformed. And the weight you feel is not a sign of failure. It is a sign of movement, because God does not disturb a life He plans to leave unchanged. He disrupts what He intends to transform. And if everything feels different right now, it is because something greater is being formed, not around you. Inside you, this time it didn't feel like distance. It felt intentional, and that is what makes this second weight heavier than the first. Because rejection you can blame on people, but when separation feels orchestrated, you start questioning God. You start asking things you're almost afraid to say out loud. Why would you remove what I prayed for? Why would you take what I thought was good? Why does following you feel like losing everything familiar? And here is the truth most people are never taught. God does not just add to your life. He edits it. He removes what no longer aligns with where He is taking you. Not because those things were bad, but because they are no longer right, and that difference matters more than you think. Because something can be good and still not belong in your next season. Something can be meaningful and still become a distraction. Something can feel safe and still keep you small. And when God begins preparing you for something greater, He doesn't negotiate with your comfort. He confronts it, quietly, gradually, sometimes painfully. You start noticing it in small ways first. Conversations that used to flow now feel forced. Places that once felt alive now feel empty. Connections that once felt effortless now require effort. And you try to fix it. You try to revive it. You try to hold on to it because it mattered to you. But the more you force it, the more unnatural it feels. And that's when confusion sets in, because nothing dramatic happened. No betrayal, no clear reason, just change. And that kind of change is the hardest to process. Because you can't point to a moment, you can't explain it to others. You just feel it deep inside. Something has shifted. And here is what you need to understand. When God begins elevating your purpose, He reduces your dependencies. He starts removing the things you leaned on so you learn to lean on Him. Not theoretically, not spiritually in words, but practically, daily, personally. And that process feels like loss before it feels like growth. Because you are used to connection, used to familiarity, used to having people around who understand you without explanation. And suddenly that disappears or fades or becomes distant. and you sit there wondering if you did something wrong. But maybe, just maybe, this is not about what you did. Maybe this is about what God is doing, because every person in Scripture who carried something significant walked through this exact pattern. Not publicly at first, privately, quietly, without explanation. Think about it. Before the promise expands, the environment contracts. Before influence increases, the circle decreases. Before clarity arrives, noise is removed. This is not accidental, it is intentional design, because God knows something most people ignore. You cannot hear clearly in a crowded room, and some of you have been surrounded by so many voices that you lost the ability to recognize His. Opinions, expectations, pressure, approval, rejection, all of it mixing together until your direction becomes unclear. So what does He do? He lowers the volume, not gently, sometimes suddenly. And when the noise disappears, silence takes its place. And silence feels uncomfortable, because silence forces you to face yourself. No distractions, no external validation, no constant reassurance. Just you and the truth. And that is where real transformation begins, because in silence, masks fall off. In silence, motives are exposed. In silence, identity is rebuilt. And most people avoid this stage. They rush to fill the quiet, new people, new habits, new distractions, anything to avoid sitting in the stillness. But if you skip this part, you delay everything that comes after, because clarity is not found in noise. It is found in stillness, and stillness requires separation, not forever, but for a season, a necessary one. And I know, it doesn't feel noble. It feels lonely. It feels like something is missing. It feels like something. You're watching life continue without you while you're stuck in this in-between space. Not where you were, not yet where you're going, just suspended, and that space can make you question everything, your relationships, your purpose, even your worth. But let me say something clearly. This is not abandonment. This is preparation. There is a difference. Abandonment leaves you empty. Preparation fills you differently. Slowly, quietly, deeply. You may not feel it immediately, but something is being built inside you, strength you didn't have before, discernment you didn't need before, independence you avoided before. And these things cannot develop in crowded environments. They require solitude, they require pressure, they require time. And here is where it becomes even more challenging, because while you are being shaped internally, externally, things may not make sense, you may not see progress, you may not see results, you may not see confirmation, and that lack of visible movement can make you doubt the process. Am I stuck? Am I going backwards? Did I miss something? But growth is not always visible. Especially at the beginning, roots grow before branches appear. Foundations are laid before structures rise, and if you judge your progress only by what you can see, you will miss what is actually happening, because the most important changes are internal. They are happening in your thinking, in your perspective, in your values, in your tolerance for things you once accepted. And those shifts are subtle, but they are powerful. They change how you respond, how you decide, how you move, and eventually they change your entire life. But before that happens, there is tension, because part of you still remembers the old environment, still craves the old familiarity, still wants things to go back to how they were, and another part of you knows you can't go back. Even if you tried, it wouldn't feel the same, because you're not the same. And that internal conflict creates discomfort. You feel pulled in two directions: comfort versus calling, familiarity versus growth, stability versus purpose. And choosing growth means letting go of what once felt safe. And that is never easy, but it is necessary, because what God is building in you cannot coexist with everything you used to hold on to. Some things have to fall away, not because they were bad, but because they cannot go where you're going. And once you accept that, something shifts, the resistance softens, the confusion begins to clear, not completely, but enough for you to take the next step. And that's all you need, not the full picture, just the next step. Because purpose is not revealed all at once. It unfolds gradually, step by step, layer by layer, and separation is one of those layers, a critical one, because it teaches you something nothing else can. How to stand alone without feeling empty, how to be quiet without feeling lost, how to move forward without constant validation. And once you learn that, everything changes, because now your strength is not dependent on your environment. Your identity is not dependent on others. Your direction is not dependent on external confirmation. It comes from within, from what God is doing inside you, and that kind of stability cannot be shaken easily. But before you reach that point, there is one more layer, one more shift that catches most people off guard. Because after the silence, after the separation, after the internal work begins, something else starts rising, not around you, but within you. And it's harder to ignore than anything before it, because this time, it's not about what you lost. It's about what you're becoming. And that change starts to affect everything. The way you think, the way you speak, the way you react, even the things you tolerate. Suddenly, things that never bothered you before start to feel wrong. Conversations feel heavier. Habits feel uncomfortable. Choices you once made easily now come with hesitation, and you don't understand why. Because nothing external changed, but internally, everything is shifting. And that leads us to the next weight. Not external pressure, not relational tension, but something deeper, something more personal, something you can't escape, because it lives inside you. And we're going there next. Now, this is where it becomes impossible to ignore. Because what was once external pressure has now turned into internal confrontation. And that changes everything, because you can walk away from people. You can distance yourself from environments. But you cannot escape yourself. And when this phase begins, it feels like something inside you has been turned up, sharpened, intensified. You start noticing things you used to overlook. Not in others, in you, the way you react, the tone behind your words, the motives behind your actions, even the thoughts you don't say out loud. And suddenly, they don't sit right anymore. Things that once felt normal now feel misaligned. Things that once felt harmless now feel heavy. And you start asking a different kind of question. Not why is this happening to me, but what is happening inside me? And that question is the beginning of transformation, because most people spend their lives trying to control what's around them. Very few have the courage to confront what's within them. But when God begins to reshape your life, He doesn't start with your circumstances. He starts with your core, your thinking, your desires, your patterns, the parts of you that nobody sees, but everything flows from. And this is the part that humbles you, because you realize something uncomfortable. Not everything that held you back was external. Some of it was internal. Patterns you repeated, reactions you justified, mindsets you never questioned. And now you can see them clearly. And clarity can feel like pressure, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize it, you can't ignore it. And that awareness creates tension, because part of you wants to stay the same. It's easier, familiar, comfortable. But another part of you knows staying the same is no longer an option. And that internal conflict is exhausting. You find yourself pausing before responding, questioning your own intentions, reflecting more than reacting, and it slows you down. Life feels different, not because it got harder, but because you became more aware. And awareness changes everything. It removes autopilot. It forces intention. It exposes the gap between who you are and who you are becoming, and that gap is where growth happens. But growth is not comfortable. It requires honesty, not surface-level honesty. Deep honesty, the kind where you stop blaming everything on others and start taking responsibility for your own patterns. And that is not easy, because it's easier to point outward than to look inward. It's easier to say they hurt me than to ask, why did I allow that? It's easier to say this always happens to me than to ask, what am I repeating? But transformation demands that level of honesty. Because God is not just preparing your future, He is refining your character. And character cannot be built on denial. It has to be built on truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, especially when it is. And here is where many people misunderstand this stage. They think this internal pressure means they are failing, that something is wrong with them, that they are becoming too sensitive, too self-critical, too aware. But the opposite is true. You are becoming aligned, because alignment always feels like tension before it feels like tension. Think about it. When something is out of place, it doesn't hurt until it starts moving back into position. That movement, that adjustment, creates discomfort, but it is necessary for proper function. And the same is true here. What you're feeling is not breakdown. It's recalibration. Your standards are changing. Your tolerance is decreasing. Your awareness is increasing, and that combination changes how you live. You begin to outgrow things internally before you ever leave them externally. And that creates a strange feeling. You're still in the same places, but you don't feel the same in them. You're still around the same people, but the connection feels different. You're still doing the same routines, but they no longer satisfy you. And that disconnect can make you feel lost, because nothing around you confirms what you're feeling inside. But that's how internal change works. It starts unseen, it starts quietly, and it starts before anything external shifts. And if you trust that process, eventually your external world will catch up to your internal reality. But before that happens, you have to walk through this phase. The phase where you see more, feel more, question more. The phase where your conscience becomes louder, not condemning, but convicting. And there's a difference. Condemnation makes you feel stuck. Conviction moves you forward. Condemnation tells you this is who you are. Conviction shows you this is not who you have to remain. And that difference changes how you respond, because instead of shutting down, you lean in. Instead of avoiding, you address. Instead of defending, you reflect. And that shift is powerful, because now you are no longer reacting unconsciously. You are responding intentionally. And that level of awareness changes your trajectory. But it also comes with pressure, because you can no longer live casually. You can no longer ignore what you know. You can no longer pretend not to see what has been revealed to you. And that responsibility feels heavy, because now your choices carry more weight. Your decisions carry more meaning, and your direction becomes more deliberate. And this is where identity begins to shift, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady one. You start asking different questions. Not what do I want, but what aligns. Not what feels good, but what is right. Not what is easy, but what is necessary. And those questions lead to different decisions, decisions that may not make sense to others, decisions that may feel uncomfortable at first, but decisions that move you closer to who you are becoming. And that is the point of this stage. Not perfection, not immediate clarity, but alignment. Gradual, consistent, intentional alignment. And the more aligned you become, the more certain things naturally fall away. Not forced, not dramatic, just no longer compatible. And that is when you realize something important. Growth is not about adding more to your life. It is about becoming more of who you are meant to be. And that process requires letting go of who you used to be. And that letting go is not always clean. It can feel messy, emotional, confusing, because you are releasing parts of your identity that once defined you, roles you played, mindsets you held, versions of yourself that felt real at the time. And saying goodbye to that takes time, but it is necessary, because you cannot fully step into who you are becoming while still holding on to who you were. And once that shift begins to settle, something else happens, something unexpected, because after the awareness, after the internal alignment, after the letting go, your emotions start to change, not in a stable, predictable way, but in waves. One moment you feel clarity, but in waves. The next, confusion. One moment you feel peace. The next, uncertainty. And that emotional fluctuation can make you question everything again. Am I moving forward or backwards? Am I growing or just overthinking? But what you're experiencing is not instability. It's transition, because when your identity is being rebuilt, your emotions will not always be consistent. They will reflect the process, the uncertainty, the stretching, the in-between. And that leads us to the next phase, not external conflict, not internal awareness, but emotional tension. The kind that doesn't follow a straight line, the kind that rises and falls without warning. And that is where we're going next. And this is where most people start doubting the process, because emotions stop behaving the way they used to. One day you wake up with a sense of clarity you can't explain. You feel grounded, focused, certain that something meaningful is happening in your life. Even if you don't fully understand it, you feel it. A quiet confidence, a steady peace, and then, the next day, it's gone, not completely, but enough to shake you. The same thoughts that felt clear now feel foggy. The same direction that felt obvious now feels uncertain. The same faith that felt strong now feels questioned. And you sit there wondering, what changed? And that question can slowly turn into doubt. Am I just being emotional? Why can't I stay consistent? But what you're experiencing is not inconsistency. It's construction, because when something new is being built, the old structure has to be dismantled, and dismantling is not stable. It is not clean. It does not follow a straight line. It shifts, it moves, it unsettles, and your emotions reflect that process. They are not the foundation. They are the response. And when the foundation is being rebuilt, the response will fluctuate. That's why one moment you feel strong, and the next you feel unsure. One moment you feel peace, and the next you feel tension. It's not because you are going backwards. It's because you are no longer standing on what you used to stand on. And that space between what was and what will be is uncomfortable, because it lacks certainty, it lacks control. It forces you to trust without full understanding, and that is where most people struggle, because we are used to clarity, used to knowing what comes next, used to feeling secure before we move. But growth does not work like that. It asks you to move while you're still unsure, to trust while you're still questioning, to continue, even when your emotions are not confirming the direction. And that requires a different kind of strength, not emotional strength, but internal stability, the kind that does not depend on how you feel in the moment, the kind that remains even when your emotions shift. And that is what this phase is building. Because if your direction is based only on how you feel, you will stop every time it gets uncomfortable. But if your direction is rooted deeper in what you know, in what has been revealed to you, in what you have already discerned, then you can continue even when your emotions fluctuate. And that is maturity, not the absence of emotion, but the ability to move beyond it when necessary. And this is where something powerful begins to form. A different kind of peace, not the kind that comes from everything being clear, but the kind that exists even when things are unclear. A quiet steadiness, a grounded trust, not loud, not dramatic, but real. And that kind of peace cannot be shaken easily, because it is not tied to circumstances, it is not tied to outcomes. It is anchored deeper, and that anchor is what carries you through the rest of the process. Because there is still one final shift, one final layer that brings everything together, and it doesn't come in the form of pressure or conflict or even awareness. It comes as a pull, subtle at first, easy to ignore if you're not paying attention, but persistent. It keeps showing up in your thoughts, in your curiosity, in your desire for something more. You start feeling drawn toward things that never mattered to you before. Depth, purpose, meaning. You begin asking questions you never asked. What am I actually here for? What does my life contribute? What is worth building? Beyond survival? And those questions don't go away. They follow you quietly, consistently. And that is not random, that is awakening. Because once you've been through the tension, the separation, the internal work, the emotional instability, something inside you becomes ready. Ready for direction, ready for purpose, ready to move with intention instead of reaction. And that readiness creates a pull, not forced, not rushed, but undeniable. You feel it when you see something meaningful. You feel it when you encounter truth. You feel it when you imagine a life that aligns with who you've become. And suddenly, what once satisfied you no longer does, not because it's wrong, but because it's no longer enough. And that realization can feel unsettling at first because it disrupts your old goals, your old definitions of success, your old way of measuring progress. But it also opens something new, a deeper motivation, one that is not based on approval or comfort or routine, but on purpose. And purpose changes how you live. It changes what you prioritize, what you invest your time in, what you tolerate, what you walk away from. It brings clarity to your decisions, not instantly, but gradually. And that clarity is different from anything you've experienced before. It doesn't come from external validation. It doesn't need constant confirmation. It comes from alignment, from knowing, even without full evidence, that you are moving in the right direction, and that knowing grows stronger over time, especially when you act on it. Because purpose is not something you fully understand before you move. It is something you discover as you move, step by step, choice by choice, and that is where everything you've been through starts to make sense. The separation created space, the awareness created alignment, the emotional tension created stability, and now the pull creates direction. Everything connects, not randomly, intentionally, because what felt like chaos was actually preparation. What felt like loss was actually refinement. What felt like confusion was actually transition. And now you begin to see it, not perfectly, but enough to understand this one truth. You were never falling apart. You were being rebuilt, piece by piece, layer by layer, into someone who can carry more, see more, do more. Not because you forced it, but because you allowed the process. And that is what most people resist. The process. They want clarity without discomfort, growth without tension, purpose without preparation. But that is not how it works, because anything meaningful requires transformation, and transformation requires time. Time. It requires patience. It requires trust. And most importantly, it requires surrender, letting go of how you thought things would look, letting go of who you thought you had to be, letting go of the need to control every step. And when you finally release that, something shifts, not externally first, internally. A quiet acceptance, a steady confidence. Not because everything is resolved, but because you understand the direction. And that understanding changes how you move forward. You stop resisting the process. You stop questioning every shift. You stop trying to go back to what no longer fits, and instead you lean into what is forming, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's unclear, because now you recognize it. This is not destruction. This is construction. This is not punishment. This is preparation. This is not confusion. This is transformation. And when you see it that way, everything changes. The frustration turns into patience. The fear turns into trust. The uncertainty turns into movement. And you begin to walk differently, not rushed, not forced, but intentional, because you know something now that you didn't know before. The weight you've been feeling was never meant to break you. It was meant to build you. Every moment of tension, every season of separation, every wave of emotion, every internal shift was shaping you into someone capable of carrying what is coming next. And that is the part most people miss. They think the process is the problem, but the process is the preparation. And if you can stay through it, if you can trust through it, if you can grow through it, then what comes next will not overwhelm you, because you have been built for it. And one day you will look back at this season, the confusion, the loneliness, the pressure, the questions, and you will realize something that changes everything. None of it was wasted, not a single moment. Every piece had a purpose. Every shift had a reason. Every struggle had a role. You were not being delayed. You were being developed. You were not being ignored. You were being prepared. You were not being broken. You were being rebuilt. And that understanding becomes your foundation, a foundation that does not collapse when things get uncertain again. Because they will, growth does not end here. It continues. But now you are different, stronger, clearer, more aligned, and ready for what comes next. Not because you have all the answers, but because you have become someone who can walk without needing them. And that is the real transformation.